Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about how much of your life runs on a piece of paper somebody else fills out. A sign-in sheet, an attendance record, a form with your kid's name on it that you never actually read, because why would you? We assume those pages are true because they're boring, and boring things don't lie to us. That assumption is the softest place in most people's lives, and today's story is about a man who found out exactly how soft it was. He fixes refrigeration for a living. Walk-in coolers, ice machines, the temperature-controlled cabinets in pharmacies and clinics. It is the least glamorous job I've ever built an episode around, and by the end, you're going to understand why it terrified the people who thought they'd covered every angle. Because his whole trade is built on one idea. Cold doesn't argue with you. It doesn't get nervous. It doesn't change its story. And every time somebody opens a door they don't want you to know about, it writes it down. This one starts with a handwritten note passed back under a debit card at a drive-thru window. Stay with me to the end, because the ending is the coldest thing in it. The first thing Rayburn Halbrook noticed that Tuesday was that the ice machine at Rooster's drive-thru was singing wrong. Everybody else in Brannock, Indiana heard a hum. Ray heard a compressor working 11% harder than it should on a 64-degree morning, which meant a dirty condenser coil, which meant a service call in 2 weeks that the owner couldn't afford. He'd been listening to machines like that since he was 14, standing on an upturned milk crate in his father's shop, while Emmett Halbrook taught him the trade the way other fathers taught fishing. His father had a saying he repeated so often, it stopped being advice and became furniture in Ray's head. People lie, Rayburn. Paper lies. Cold doesn't. Cold just keeps the receipts. Halbrook Cold Chain had 11 accounts when Ray's father died, and 93 by the time Ray turned 41. Restaurants, 2 grocery chains, a blood bank in Fort Wayne, the vaccine fridges at 3 county health clinics, and a small but very profitable specialty, validated cold chain monitoring. That meant data loggers, little sealed sensors that sat inside a medical refrigerator and recorded the temperature every 60 seconds, plus every single time the door opened and how long it stayed open, and stamped it all with a time nobody on site could edit. Hospitals needed it. Pharmacies needed it. Anywhere a drug had to stay between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius or become worthless, somebody had to be able to prove it did. Ray was good at it because he was patient in a way that made other people uncomfortable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fill silence. When a restaurant owner screamed at him about a compressor that failed because they'd ignored 4 written warnings, Ray would wait until the man ran out of air, then say, "All right," and start working. His wife had once called it the most infuriating quality a human being could possess. She'd said it fondly, back then. That Tuesday he had a route, Roosters at 11:15, a bakery on Ravenna Road, then the long haul out to the county clinic in Delph. He stopped at Roosters because he was hungry, and because Ray Halbrook had never in his life driven past a machine he was worried about without at least putting his hand on it. Roosters was a 2-lane drive-thru with a walk-up window, a hand-painted rooster on the side, and a 19-year-old at the register named Josefina Arriaga, who everyone called Fina. She worked mornings and took nursing prerequisites at night at the community college in Delph, and she had the kind of face that could not, physically, could not, hide what she was thinking. Ray ordered a coffee and a sausage biscuit and handed over his debit card. Fina took it. She held it a second longer than a card needs to be held. Then she leaned out of the window, and instead of just handing it back, she pressed it into his palm with both of her hands wrapped around his, the way you'd give somebody a key. "Sir," she said, "quiet. Read it in the parking lot. Not here." Ray felt the folded paper tucked under the card before he saw it. He looked at her. She looked back at him, with her jaw set and her eyes glassy, and she said, "Please." And then the drive-thru speaker crackled with the next order, and she turned away, because she had to. He pulled into the gravel patch behind the dumpster corral. He unfolded the paper on the steering wheel. It was a sheet from an order pad, and she had written on it in small, careful block letters, the way you write when you've rewritten it 3 times before you dared hand it over. "Your daughter comes here every school day, at 11:40, with a man in a gray truck. She never orders. She never looks up. Today she dropped something by the window. I kept it for you." Ray read it 3 times. His first thought was that it was a mistake, because that was the merciful thought, and his brain reached for it automatically. He had one daughter. Josie Halbrook was 9 years old, 3rd grade at Ardmill Elementary, and at 11:40 on a Tuesday, she was supposed to be in a cafeteria, arguing about whether a hot dog was a sandwich. His second thought was colder and more precise, and it was the thought of a man who read data for a living. Every school day, not once, not a coincidence, a schedule. He didn't call his wife. Later, when people asked him what made him not call Lorena first, he would say he didn't have a reason, and that wasn't true. The reason was that for 8 months, whenever he'd asked Lorena a simple question, he'd gotten an answer that had been thought about first, and a man who spends his life listening to compressors learns to hear when something is working harder than the load requires. He called the school. The front office at Ardmill picked up on the 4th ring. Annika Lofton, the attendance clerk, had known Josie since kindergarten and knew Ray's voice before he finished saying his name. "I need to know if my daughter's on campus right now," he said. There was the clatter of a keyboard. "She's marked present, Mr. Halbrook. All day. Full attendance this month, actually. She's got a perfect record." "Can you look at her? Physically? Can somebody walk down and look at her with their eyes?" A pause, the specific pause of a woman deciding whether a parent is having a crisis. "Mr. Halbrook, is everything? Please." He heard the phone set down. He heard the ordinary noise of a school going on with its day, a bell, a rolling cart, a kid laughing in a hallway. It took 4 minutes. Ray sat in his truck and watched the digital clock on the dash go from 11:31 to 11:35, and his coffee sat in the cup holder untouched and cooling, and he thought about the fact that the note said 11:40. At 11:38, he started his engine and pulled around to the front of the building where he could see the drive-through lane and the road that fed it. At 11:39, Annika Lofton came back on the line, and her voice had changed. It was careful now, and a little defensive, which told Ray everything before she said a word. "She's not in the classroom at the moment," Annika said. "But she is marked present, and that's correct, because she's in the enrichment block. It's off-site. It's a district-approved vendor program, the gifted pullout. Your wife signed the release in September. There's a signed release in her file, Mr. Halbrook. I'm looking at it right now." "Off-site where?" "It doesn't say where. It says the vendor provides transportation." "Who signed for the vendor?" "Papers. There's a signature. I honestly can't read it. It's initials." At 11:40, a gray Chevrolet Silverado, newer model, a dent in the tailgate, and a magnetic placard on the driver's door that Ray couldn't read at that distance, rolled into the outer lane of Rooster's drive-thru. It stopped at the window. It idled there maybe 40 seconds. Then it pulled out onto Ravenna Road heading east, and it did not go toward Ardmill Elementary. And in the passenger seat, in a gray hooded sweatshirt with the hood up in 70-degree weather, sat a small girl with her chin down and her hands flat on her knees, like somebody had told her exactly how to sit. Ray knew the shape of his own daughter's shoulders. He'd carried her on them for 6 years. He did not follow the truck. That decision would matter later, and it was the hardest thing he ever did, and he made it in about a second and a half. Because a man who chases a truck gets a confrontation on a county road, and a confrontation is one man's word against another's. Ray Halbrook had spent 20 years learning that if you want to win, you don't argue with the machine. You go get the log. He hung up on Annika Lofton mid-sentence, drove around the building, and parked at the walk-up window at Rooster's. Fina came out the side door with her apron still on and a manager yelling something behind her that she ignored completely. She had a small plastic snack bag in her hand, the kind with the blue zipper seal, and she was holding it away from her body like it was hot. "She dropped it," Fina said. "Not dropped. She pushed it out the window when he was paying. She looked right at me, and she pushed it out and put her hand back down." Fina's chin was shaking. "I've done my clinical rotations, sir. I've done 14 weeks. I know what that is. I know what that is." She put the bag in his hands. Ray looked down at it through the plastic, and the parking lot went very quiet and very far away, and he felt the blood leave his face the way it does when your body understands something a half-second before you do. Inside the bag there was a hospital identification wristband, cut open, printed with a barcode and a name that was not his daughter's name. There was a blister card of 8 white capsules with 3 punched out and no pharmacy label of any kind. There was a torn adhesive label with the words Orchard 2, HP 4417, Subagy 07, and a date from that morning. And there was a folded quarter page from a coloring book, and on the back of it, in his daughter's pencil handwriting, in the careful capitals she used when she was trying to be neat, it said, "They said not to tell you until after the last one." Ray Halbrook stood in the gravel behind a drive-thru with his 93 accounts and his patient hands and his father's voice in his head, and he called the police. The officer who came out was named Deputy Corley, and he was 26, and he did everything right by the book, which is another way of saying he did nothing at all. He photographed the bag, he wrote down the note, he asked whether Ray had legal custody, and Ray said he had joint custody because he and Lorena were still married and still, technically, living in the same house. Corley's shoulders came down 2 inches when he heard that. "So Mom took her out of school," Corley said. "Mom took her out of school every day for 8 months and had her dosed with something in a plastic card with no label on it. You don't know that. I know there are 3 missing." Corley looked at the capsules. He was not a stupid young man, and Ray watched him weigh a domestic he did not want against a paperwork trail he did not understand, and watched the paperwork win. He said he'd write it up. He said if Ray wanted to make it a real thing, the words he needed were Child Protective Services, and that a lot of families used clinical studies for free care, and there was nothing illegal about a study. He gave Ray a case number on a torn slip and drove away, and Ray sat in the gravel lot and put the case number in the same pocket as Fina's note. And that was the moment the story stopped being about what had happened and started being about what Ray was going to do. He got home at 4. Their house sat on 2 acres off Wicker Road, with a shop out back where Ray kept his loggers and his manifold gauges, and a wall of his father's tools he'd never had the heart to sell. Lorena's car was in the drive. Josie's backpack was on the bench by the door, and Josie was on the living room floor with a tablet, and when she saw him she came across the room fast and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face into his shirt and did not say anything for a while. Ray crouched down. Up close he saw things he had been letting himself explain away for months. She'd lost weight. There was a shadow of a bruise on the inside crease of her left elbow, small and round, the size of a pea, greenish at the edge, the kind you get from a needle when whoever did it was in a hurry. Her lips were dry and cracked, and when she reached for her water glass, her hand had a fine tremor in it, so slight you'd only see it if you'd known that hand, since it was the size of a plum. "Hey, Bug," he said, "how was enrichment?" Josie's whole body went still. That was the answer. A 9-year-old cannot manufacture that stillness. "It's fine," she said, in a voice she'd been given. Lorena came out of the kitchen drying her hands, and Ray stood up, and for the first time in 8 months, he really looked at his wife. Lorena Halbrook, née Winsett, had grown up in a house in Brannock, where the front room was for company, and nobody was ever allowed to sit in it. Her mother, Estella Winsett, had spent 30 years running a bridal shop and running everyone in a 50-mile radius, and had raised her daughters on the belief that appearances weren't shallow, they were structural, and that a woman who let people see her struggling had already lost. Estella had never liked Ray, not because he was a bad man, because he was a man who came home with condenser grease on his forearms and did not care who saw. Lorena had loved him for that once. Ray remembered the exact night it started to come apart, and it wasn't a fight. It was a Christmas party at Estella's 4 years ago, when a man asked Ray what he did, and Ray said he fixed refrigerators, and Lorena had said, quickly, over the top of him, he owns a company, and Ray had watched his wife's face while she said it, and understood that she'd been embarrassed for a while, and had been hiding it well. After that came the money, not poverty. Halbrook Cold Chain cleared good money. But Lorena had started a boutique event styling business that lost $40,000 in 2 years, and Estella had covered it. And Estella did not give money. She extended terms. And somewhere in there, Lorena had started going to a Thursday evening thing at the community center in Delph, a group with a name like a candle brand, where a woman with very white teeth talked about scarcity thinking. Ray had thought it was harmless. "You want to tell me about the gifted program?" Ray said. Lorena folded the towel. She always folded things before she lied. It gave her hands something honest to do. It's a study program. It's fine. It's free, Ray, which is more than you can say for anything else in this house. There's no gifted program with a gray truck. You followed her? And there it was. Not what are you talking about. Not she was at school. Straight past denial into the question of how much he'd seen, which is the single most incriminating sentence a person can choose. And Lorena Halbrook was not a stupid woman. She was a cornered one. It's a clinical study, she said, when the silence got long enough to hurt. It's at a research center. They monitor her. They check her blood work. They give her a physical every month, and they pay us a stipend for our time. $1,100 a visit, Ray. $1,100. Do you know what that's done for us? Do you know that I paid my mother back? Do you know I have never once, not once, had to ask you for anything since March? What is she being treated for? Lorena looked at him. Lorena, what is my daughter being treated for? It's a wellness protocol, she said. It's preventative. It's for kids with markers. Whose name is on her wristband? That one landed. It landed so hard that Lorena's face did something Ray had never seen it do. A kind of collapse and reset, the way a building does before it comes down. And she said fast, Don't you dare come in here, and you are gone 11 hours a day. You have never once asked what it costs to run this, and now you want to be the, whose name? Get out of my kitchen, Lorena said. He didn't. He went out to his shop and sat on the stool his father used to sit on, and he took out the plastic bag and set the 4 objects on the workbench in a row, under the drop light, and he started doing the only thing he had ever been good at, which was reading a machine by its outputs. Orchard 2. That was a study name. HP 4417 was a protocol number, and the HP almost certainly meant a sponsor's initials. Sub J07 was a subject slot. The wristband said Mayfield, Mirabelle, and a date of birth in March 2017, which made that child 7 years old, and Josie was 9 and born in June. The capsules were unmarked, which meant investigational. Commercial pills are stamped, study drug usually isn't. And the 4th object, the coloring book page, was the only one that mattered, and the only one he couldn't run a query on. They said not to tell you until after the last one. Ray read it maybe 40 times that night. The last one. There was a number, there was a schedule, and there was an end date, and somebody had told his daughter she had to hold out until then. He drove to Delph the next morning at 7, before his first call, and he found Fairlane Plaza, a tired strip mall on the east side with a nail salon, a tax place that only opened in spring, a vacant unit that used to be a Rite Aid, and, at the far end, a smoked glass storefront with vinyl letters, Orchard Clinical Research, Volunteers Welcome, You May Qualify. Ray sat in the lot with a coffee for 90 minutes and counted. 14 people went in that morning. 6 were children. 3 of the children came out of the same gray Silverado, and the man who drove it got out to open the door for them, and Ray got his first good look at him. He was maybe 35, with the build of a guy who'd played high school football and had kept the shoulders and let the rest go. He wore a polo with an embroidered logo and a lanyard. He held the door and he touched each kid on the top of the head as they went past, and he was smiling the entire time, and there was something in the smile that made Ray's hands close. The magnetic placard on the truck door said Orchard Clinical Research, Patient Transport, and under it a name, Z. Pruitt. Ray went home that night and did the thing he'd been avoiding for a week, which was open his wife's laptop while she was in the shower. It took him 4 minutes. Zane Pruitt's messages went back 11 months. Ray did not read them all. He read enough to know the shape of it, that it had started at the Thursday group in Delph, that Zane had been the one who suggested the study, that Lorena had asked in April whether it was safe, and Zane had written back a paragraph about how the whole point was that it was monitored, that these kids get better care than yours gets at a pediatrician, and that in May, when Lorena had asked what happens if Ray finds out, Zane had written, he won't. And if he does, what's he going to do? Call a cop and say his wife enrolled his kid in a medical study? You're her mother. Mom signs. That's the whole system, babe. Ray closed the laptop. He sat in the dark in the kitchen for a long time. Then he got a legal pad out of the drawer and wrote a single line at the top, the way his father had taught him to start every diagnostic. What does the machine have to do that it can't fake? Underneath he wrote, they have to open the refrigerator. A clinical trial site is a business, and like every business, it has a way it gets paid, and Ray spent the next week learning it the way he learned any unfamiliar system, from the plumbing up. A drug company, the sponsor, pays a middleman company called a CRO to run a study. The CRO recruits sites, private clinics, storefront research centers, doctors with a spare exam room. Each site gets paid per enrolled subject, and then per completed visit, and then a bonus per subject who finishes the whole protocol. On a pediatric study, where children are hard to recruit and every parent is nervous, those numbers go up. Way up. A site that could reliably produce children was worth more than a site that produced adults, in the same way a well that never runs dry is worth more than a well. And the entire structure sat on one assumption, that the sites were telling the truth. The people watching were called monitors, and they came from the CRO, and they came about every 6 weeks, and they checked the paperwork against the source documents, which meant that a site that was willing to write good paperwork could go a long time before anybody with a flashlight looked underneath it. Ray learned most of that from the internet in 3 nights. He learned the rest of it from a man named Newton Prather, who he found because Ray Halbrook's actual superpower was that he had spent 20 years being pleasant to every service manager, landlord, and building super in 4 counties, and one of them remembered that the unit at the end of Fairlane Plaza had been leased to a research company that had some trouble with an old fella a couple years back. Newt Prather was 52, worked nights at a feed mill, and lived in a rented house in Delph with a wall of photos of a boy in a baseball uniform. He let Ray in and put coffee on before Ray had finished explaining, and then he went and got a shoebox off the top of a closet and set it on the table like a man handing over ammunition he'd been saving. 2 years and 4 months, Newt said. That's how long I've been waiting for somebody to knock on my door about this. His grandson Ellis had been 8. Newt's daughter had a bad year, a bad boyfriend, a bad string of choices, and Zane Pruitt had come out of the Thursday group at Delph, the same way he'd come at Lorena. The boy went to the site 3 times a week for 5 months. He got nosebleeds, he got tired, he stopped growing for a while. And when Newt tried to raise hell, they'd handed him a stack of consent forms with his daughter's signature on every page, and a very polite letter from a lawyer, and a county caseworker had come out to Newt's house instead of theirs. They flipped it on me in 9 days, Newt said. I went from a grandpa asking questions to a man with a file. That's what they do. They don't fight you. They make you the problem. 'Cause a man defending himself ain't investigating nobody. Inside the shoebox, 41 visit receipts, a torn appointment card, 2 blister cards identical to the one Josie had dropped, and a photograph Newt had taken through a windshield of a gray truck that in those days had been a white van. They ever pay you the stipend? Ray asked. $800 a visit, and it went to my daughter, and it went right back out the same day. Newt shook his head slowly. That ain't the money, though. That's the bait money. Whatever they're pulling out the other end, it's bigger. You don't build all that machinery to hand out $800. Ray took the shoebox home with Newt's blessing, and he did the thing he was actually elite at, which was building a table. He put every visit date from Newt's receipts in one column. He put every date he could confirm from Josie's schedule in another, reconstructed from Lorena's calendar, the school's attendance record, and the note from Fina. He built the pattern, and he stared at it for 2 nights, and then he saw it. And once he saw it, he could not unsee it. Both children had visits on days the site's own posted hours said it was closed. Not many. 4 for Ellis, 6 for Josie. But a visit is a real event with a real timestamp, and a closed clinic doesn't have one, and that meant either the posted hours were a lie or the visits were. Ray had a suspicion which, and he had, sitting in a job folder in a filing cabinet in his shop, the one thing in the world that could tell him, because in the autumn of 2021, Halbrook Cold Chain had installed 4 validated data loggers in the medication refrigerators at the Rite Aid pharmacy at the end of Fairlane Plaza. The pharmacy had closed in 2022. The fixtures had stayed, and when Orchard Clinical Research took the unit next door and expanded through the shared wall, they had inherited 2 of those refrigerators, and they had never replaced the loggers, because nobody replaces a working refrigerator's brain, and because the landlord's lease listed Cold Chain service as a building-maintained system. Ray Halbrook had a signed maintenance contract, current, with the landlord of Fairlane Plaza, that gave him the legal right to walk into that building and service those units. He nearly went that night. He sat in his truck with his keys in his hand at 10 p.m., and he made himself put them down, because his father's other rule was that a man who takes a reading before he knows what he's measuring will believe the first number he sees. He needed to know what the log would say when he pulled it. He needed somebody inside. She found him first. 10 days after the note, Ray came out of a job in Delph, and there was a young woman standing at the tailgate of his truck. 24, maybe. Scrubs under a cardigan, badge clipped and then flipped over so the photo faced her chest. Her hands were shaking so badly she had them jammed in her armpits. "You're the refrigerator man," she said. "You've been sitting in our parking lot." Her name was Annika Straub, and she was a clinical research assistant at Orchard, and she had been there 14 months, and she had gone into research because she'd wanted to be part of curing something. They talked for 2 hours in a booth at a diner where she sat facing the door. Orchard Clinical Research was owned by Dr. Ellsworth Marchetta, 61, a pediatrician who had lost hospital privileges in another state a long time ago for something nobody in Brannock had bothered to look up. He held 4 active protocols. On paper, he had a staff of 11. In practice, he had Annika, 2 part-timers, a nurse who came Wednesdays, and Zane Pruitt, whose actual job title was community liaison and whose actual job was volume. "He gets paid on heads," Annika said. "Everybody thinks the doctor's the one making money. Zane's on a bonus per enrolled pediatric subject and a bigger one per completion. It's $2,200 a head at completion. He'd bring in a kid a week. Where's he find them? Church groups, a support group he volunteers at in Delph. Single mothers, mostly. Women who are underwater." She looked at the table. Women who like being told they're doing something smart. And then Annika told him the part that made Ray put down his coffee. There were more subjects on paper than there were children in the world. Protocol HP 4417, Orchard 2, sponsor Hallowell Pharma, CRO Calyx Trials Group, was funded for 18 pediatric subjects at that site. Aneki had physically met 9. The other 9 existed as charts, names, dates of birth, consent forms, visit records, vitals and handwriting she recognized, and lab results that came back normal because the samples that went to the central lab were drawn from the 9 real kids and split into extra tubes with different barcodes. "That's why the visits run long," she said. "That's why the kids come 3 times a week when the protocol says once. We need the volume of blood for the phantoms." Her voice cracked on that word, and she pressed her hand flat on the table until it stopped. "We call them the phantoms. In the office. Like it's funny." 9 real children were being drawn, dosed, and scheduled at double and triple the rate the protocol allowed, so that 9 children who did not exist could generate visits worth $1,900 apiece to the site, and completion bonuses, and a data set that Hallowell Pharma was going to use to decide whether a drug was safe for children. "Whose name is on my daughter's wristband," Ray said. "Mirabelle Mayfield." Annika said it immediately. She'd been carrying it. She was real. She was a real patient of Dr. Marchetta's from before. She had a genuine diagnosis, and her family moved to Georgia in 2022. Her chart never closed. Slot 7 never closed. "Your daughter is being dosed as her." Ray was quiet for a while. "Which means," he said finally, "that everything they give my daughter is being recorded against a 7-year-old with a different weight." Annika nodded, and then she started to cry, and she cried the way people do when they've been holding something for 14 months. "I kept copies," she said, "everything. Every source document I could photograph. I have a binder. I've had it in my trunk since March, and I don't know what to do with it, because if I take it to the police, they'll call the site, and if I take it to the CRO, they'll tell the site, and Dr. Marchetta will shred the room in an hour, and I'll be a girl who stole documents." "Don't take it anywhere," Ray said. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because paper against paper is an argument." Ray turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. "I want to bring them something that can't argue." They came for him before he could move, which is what always happens to the patient man, and it is the price of being patient. It started with Josie collapsing. It was a Saturday, and she was in the yard, and Ray was up on a ladder cleaning the gutters, and he heard the specific sound of a body hitting ground without a hand going out first. He was off the ladder before he decided to be. She was conscious by the time he got to her, but her gums were bleeding, and her nose was bleeding, and her skin had gone the color of skim milk. And she said, "I'm okay, Daddy. It happens on Thursdays," in the flattest voice he had ever heard from a child. It happens on Thursdays. At Delft County General, a resident took one look at her blood work and stopped being casual. Her platelet count was low. Her white count was strange. There was a mild elevation in 2 liver enzymes that made him ask, twice, whether she was on any medication, and Ray said, "I don't know what it is, but here it is," and put the blister card on the counter. Ray's sister Hattie was a school nurse 2 districts over and got there in 40 minutes and did the thing Ray couldn't, which was translate. She stood in the hallway with the resident and used the words that make hospitals move. Unlabeled investigational product, pediatric, unknown dose, possible identity discrepancy in the medical record. They admitted Josie for 2 nights. Lorena arrived at 10 p.m., and Ray watched his wife walk down that hallway, and he saw, for about 4 seconds, the woman he'd married. She went straight past him to the bed and put her forehead against Josie's hair and made a sound that wasn't performed. Then her phone buzzed in her hand, and she read it, and Ray watched something close behind her eyes like a shutter. In the corridor, she said, "You had no right to bring her here without telling me." She fell down in the grass, Lorena. They'll pull her from the protocol. Ray looked at his wife for a long moment. "Say that again," he said, "and listen to it." She didn't. She left at 11. And at 8:40 the next morning, a woman from the county came to Josie's hospital room with a clipboard, because at 7 a.m., Lorena Halbrook had filed for an emergency ex parte custody order alleging that Rayburn Halbrook had removed a minor from a treatment protocol against medical advice, was exhibiting escalating paranoid behavior, had accessed his wife's private communications, and had been surveilling a medical facility. Every single allegation was technically true. That was the craft of it. Newt Prather had told him exactly what they'd do, and Ray had still walked into it, because there's no way to look at a note from a drive-thru window and not go look at the plaza. The order granted Lorena temporary primary custody, pending a hearing in 19 days. Ray got Wednesdays and every other weekend, supervised at a visitation center on Route 9 with a fluorescent light that buzzed. They took the rest of him apart on a schedule. 2 of his grocery accounts terminated in the same week, both citing vendor consolidation, and both signed by a regional manager whose wife did the books at a company that leased space from the same landlord as Fairlane Plaza. The Delft clinic postponed his validation contract. Somebody left a printed sheet of the custody filing on the counter of a diner where half his customers ate breakfast. Ray lost 19% of his revenue in 11 days, and his insurance carrier called about an inquiry. And Zane Pruitt came to the shop. He came at dusk on a Tuesday, and he leaned in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, the way a man does when he wants you to know he isn't worried. And he looked around at the tools and the loggers and the neat labeled bins, and he said, "This is a nice little setup, man." Ray kept working. "I want you to know there's nothing personal in any of this," Zane said. "You're a good provider. Lorena says that all the time." He smiled. She's got a bigger idea of what her life's supposed to look like, and you were never going to be able to give her that. And that's not a knock. That's just math." Ray set down the torque wrench. "You want to know the part I actually like?" Zane said. "You already lost. Not because I'm smarter, because there's a form for everything I did, and there's no form for what you're feeling. That's it. That's the whole thing. Paperwork beats fathers. Every time." Ray walked over. Zane's weight shifted. He'd been in a few parking lots in his life, and he was ready for one now. And there was a flicker of something almost hopeful in his face, because a man who takes a swing at you is a man who has just handed you his own custody hearing. Ray reached past him and pulled the shop door open wider. "You should go," Ray said. "There's a lot of steel in here, and it's all mine." That was the closest Ray Halbrook ever came, and he'd tell you later it was the hardest thing he'd ever not done, harder than not following the truck, and that both of those decisions are the only reason the ending exists. 9 days before the hearing, Aneke called him from a gas station and told him that Orchard had closed slot 7. They'd terminated Josie from the protocol, marked her early withdrawal, parental request, pulled the physical chart out of the active drawer, and Dr. Marchetta had spent Friday afternoon with the shredder running and the door locked. Zane hadn't been in for 2 days. The gray truck was gone from the lot. "They're cleaning," Anarchy said. "There's a monitoring visit coming, and they're cleaning everything." "When's the monitoring visit?" "The 19th. 9 a.m. The CRO sends a monitor from Calyx. It's a full-source data verification. The sponsor's sending somebody too, because the enrollment numbers at this site are so good that Hallowell wants to feature us as a high-performing—" She laughed, once, horribly. "They're going to give him an award, Ray." Ray stood in his shop with the phone against his ear and looked at the legal pad still hanging on the nail where he'd left it 3 weeks earlier, with one line at the top. "What does the machine have to do that it can't fake?" "Anarchy," he said. "Tell me about the drug fridge." Here is what Ray Halbrook understood that nobody at Orchard Clinical Research ever thought about for 10 consecutive seconds in their lives. An investigational drug is not a bottle of aspirin. It is legally controlled material that belongs to the sponsor until it goes into a patient, and every single unit of it has to be accounted for. Received, stored between 2 and 8 degrees, dispensed, returned, destroyed. The site keeps a drug accountability log. The monitor checks that log against the actual bottles in the actual refrigerator. If the log says you dispensed a bottle on a Tuesday, there had better be a hole in the inventory shaped exactly like that Tuesday. And the refrigerator that held the Orchard 2 supply was one of 2 units that Halbrook Cold Chain had installed loggers in October of 2021, when that space was a pharmacy. Those loggers recorded temperature every 60 seconds. They also recorded every door open event, the timestamp it opened, and how many seconds it stayed open. Because a door standing open is how a $40,000 shipment dies. They stored 14 months of history in onboard memory. They were sealed. They were calibrated annually with a certificate. And, this was the part Ray had built his business on, they could not be edited from inside the building. Not by the site, not by Marchetta. The clock was synchronized to a reference server. The memory was right once, and the only person with the service key was the vendor. Ray was the vendor. He sat down that night and he did not go to the police, because the police had given him a case number on a torn slip. He didn't go to the CRO, because Aneka had told him what happens when the CRO calls the site. And he didn't go to a lawyer first, because a lawyer would tell him to wait for the hearing. He went and found the one agency in the United States whose entire job is investigational drug fraud, and whose agents carry guns, and whose name almost nobody knows: the Food and Drug Administration's Office of Criminal Investigations. Special Agent Trudy Sepulveda ran the field office 3 hours north. She had 11 years in, and she had the specific weariness of somebody who has spent a decade watching cases die because nobody could prove intent. She agreed to 20 minutes on a Thursday because a citizen had used the phrase "phantom pediatric subjects" on the phone, and she'd never had anybody use it correctly before. Ray brought a folder. He put down Fina's note. He put down Newt Prather's shoebox, with a spreadsheet on top. He put down the wristband with another child's name, and the blister card, and the hospital record from Delph County General. He put down Anarchy Straub's name and a statement she'd signed, and told Sepulveda that the binder existed and where it was. Then he put down the last thing, which was a printed sample page of a data logger export, and he explained what it was for 11 minutes without stopping. And when he was done, Special Agent Trudy Sepulveda sat back in her chair for a long moment. "Say the last part again," she said. "Their own records will say they dispensed drug to Subject 7 on 26 specific dates," Ray said. "Some of those dates, that refrigerator never opened. Not once, all day. And on the days it did open, I can tell you what time, and how long, and how many times, and I can put that next to their visit logs, and their sign-in sheets, and their transport schedule, and my daughter's school attendance." He tapped the page. "They wrote a story. I've got the weather report for every day in it." "And you can't coach a thermometer, ma'am." Sepulveda was quiet. "The monitoring visit's the 19th, Ray said. "Sponsors coming. CROs coming. Every piece of paper they've ever forged is going to be in that room at 9 in the morning, laid out on a table in front of the 2 companies they stole from." And you want us there? No, ma'am, Ray said. I want them to open the refrigerator while you're there. Because the second they open that door, it writes it down. And then we know their log, and my log, came from the same room on the same morning. And every place the two disagree, that's the fraud. Time-stamped. Special Agent Sepulveda looked at the sample page for a long time. Mr. Halbrook, she said, how would you get them to open it? Ray almost smiled. It was the first time in 5 weeks. They'll open it, he said, because it's going to start beeping. Here is what a validated cold chain system requires, in writing, every 12 months, on a schedule set by the manufacturer and referenced in the maintenance rider of the Fairlane Plaza lease. An annual verification. The vendor attends on site. The vendor confirms probe calibration against a certified reference. And the vendor performs a functional alarm test, in which the system is deliberately driven past its high threshold to confirm that the alarm sounds, the notification fires, and the facility's response procedure works. Ray scheduled it through the landlord's property manager, by email, 11 days in advance, on the annual date the system had been installed. It was the single most boring document in the entire case, and it was the whole key. He was not sneaking into that building. He was showing up on the day his contract said he showed up, to do the job the contract said he did, and there wasn't a lawyer alive who could make it look like anything else. He asked for one adjustment. He asked to be scheduled for 8:15 in the morning on the 19th, because that was the earliest slot before the tenant's business day. The property manager wrote back, "Fine by us." The other half of the trap was written by Orchard Clinical Research themselves, 2 years earlier, in a document nobody there had read since. Annika found it in the SOP binder and photographed all 4 pages. Standard Operating Procedure 11B, Temperature Excursion, Investigational Product. In the event of a documented excursion alarm, the site shall immediately quarantine all affected investigational product, perform a full physical inventory reconciliation against the drug accountability log, document all discrepancies, and notify the sponsor within 24 hours. Dr. Ellsworth Marchetta had signed that page himself. He'll follow it, Annika said. That's the thing about him. He forges everything, and he follows every rule that's about looking good in front of a monitor. If that alarm goes off with Calyx in the building, he will do the reconciliation on the table, out loud, because not doing it would look worse. Special Agent Trudy Sepulveda took 8 days to get what she needed, which by federal standards was sprinting. She had Annika Straub's binder, 1,100 photographed source pages, and a sworn statement, and Newt Prather's shoebox, and the Delph County General Records, and a subpoena return from Calyx Trials Group showing that Site 4417-11 had billed for 206 pediatric visits in 14 months. She had a search warrant for the premises, the servers, and the physical charts, signed at 4 p.m. on the 18th. And she had one thing that made the whole apparatus click into place. Ray Halbrook's 14 months of logger history, exported under his own vendor key, notarized and sealed, with an affidavit from the manufacturer explaining that the memory could not be altered from the site. The morning of the 19th was gray and cool, and there was frost on the windshields in Fairlane Plaza. At 8:14 a.m., Ray Halbrook parked his service truck in the fire lane at the far end, put on a clean uniform shirt, picked up his case, and walked in the front door of Orchard Clinical Research like he had 100 other doors that year. The girl at the desk didn't look up. "You're the fridge guy?" "Annual verification," Ray said. "Should take an hour." He worked. He genuinely worked. He pulled both probes, checked them against his reference, logged the offsets, replaced a gasket on the smaller unit that had been failing since spring, and wrote the ticket. In the back, a percolator ran and somebody set out a plate of grocery store Danish. And at 8:50, a woman in a blazer arrived with a rolling case and introduced herself as the monitor from Calyx. And at 8:55, a second man arrived from Hallowell Pharma with a leather folder. And at 9, Dr. Ellsworth Marchetta came out of his office in a white coat he did not need to wear and shook both their hands and said, "We're very proud of our numbers here." At 9:06, the front door opened, and 2 men and a woman came in. And the woman held up a folded paper and said, "Doctor, I'm Special Agent Sepulveda with the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations. We have a warrant for these premises. I need everyone to step away from the computers." Ray was on one knee at the drug refrigerator with the door closed and the alarm test loaded on his handheld, and he watched Marchetta's face. And Marchetta did the thing that Ray had bet the entire operation on. He didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. He turned to the monitor from Calix, and he smiled, and he said, "This is obviously a misunderstanding, and I'd like you both to stay, because I have nothing to hide from my sponsor." At 9:20 a.m., per the annual verification schedule filed 11 days earlier, Rayburn Halbrook ran the functional alarm test on Unit 2. The alarm on a medical-grade refrigerator is not a friendly sound. It is a flat, ugly, two-tone electronic scream designed to be heard through a wall by a person who is thinking about something else, and it filled that storefront, and it did not stop. Marchetta's head came around. "That's the annual test," Ray said, and held up the ticket. "You'll want to run your excursion procedure. I'll wait." And there it was, Sepulveda standing there with a warrant, the monitor from Calix, with her pen already out, because a monitor's entire existence is documenting exactly this. The man from Hallowell, a federal agent's phone recording, and on the wall, in a laminated frame, Standard Operating Procedure 11B, with Ellsworth Marchetta's signature at the bottom. He had, in that moment, exactly two options, and both of them were the end of him. He opened the refrigerator. They counted it on the table, out loud, for 50 minutes, the way the SOP said. Bottle by bottle, kit by kit, subject slot by subject slot, and the monitor from Calix read the drug accountability log aloud, and every time she read a line, Ray Halbrook, who had not been asked to leave, because he was still on the clock, and nobody had thought about him at all, looked at the export on his handheld. Slot 7, dispensed March 4th. Ray's log, door not opened, 00000 SOD to 2359. Slot 7, dispensed March 11th. Door not opened. Slot 11, one of the phantoms, dispensed 9 times. That refrigerator had opened 4 times in the entire month. At the 8th discrepancy, the monitor from Calix stopped reading and set down the log and said, very quietly, "Doctor, I'm going to stop and call my director now." At 11:40 a.m., while agents were carrying server towers past the nail salon, a gray Chevrolet Silverado with a magnetic placard on the door turned into Fairlane Plaza with 3 children in it, because Zane Pruitt had 4 makeup visits to close out before the audit ended and had not answered his phone since 8:30. He saw the vehicles. He saw the front door propped open. He stopped in the middle of the lot, and he put it in reverse, and then he saw the man standing behind him at the edge of the parking lot with his arms folded. A service truck, a clean uniform shirt, a face he'd leaned in a doorway and smiled at 3 weeks ago. Ray didn't move toward him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in the gap Zane needed to back into, in a public parking lot, in front of a federal agent and 11 witnesses, and he waited, exactly the way he had waited for every screaming restaurant owner in 4 counties to run out of air. Zane Pruitt put the truck in park and got out with his hands up, which was the smartest thing he did that year. At 11:52, Lorena Halbrook arrived to sign a withdrawal form and collect a final stipend check, and walked into a scene she did not understand for about 4 seconds. Then she did. Ray watched his wife stand in the middle of that parking lot with her keys in her hand and her mouth open, and she looked past all of it, past the agents and the boxes and the truck, and she found him. He didn't go to her. He walked to the gray Silverado, and he opened the passenger door, and he crouched down in the gravel, and he unbuckled a 9-year-old boy in a hooded sweatshirt who was sitting with his chin down and his hands flat on his knees, like somebody had told him exactly how to sit. "Hey," Ray said, "you're all done. Nobody's taking you anywhere today." The boy looked up. Ray got all 3 of them out of that truck and sat them on the tailgate of his own with the heater running and a bag of vending machine crackers, and he stayed there until the caseworkers came, because he had a very specific idea about what it does to a kid to sit alone in a parking lot while adults handle things. The custody hearing was the next morning at 10. Georgina Nunez, Ray's attorney, had prepared a careful argument and did not use most of it, because at 9:50 a.m., Special Agent Trudy Sepulveda walked into a county family courtroom in Brannock, Indiana, in a suit, and asked the judge's permission to be heard as a witness in an active federal matter. Lorena's petition was withdrawn before 11. The federal case took 14 months, and Ray Halbrook was a witness in it exactly twice, for a combined total of 6 hours, because the logger export did most of the talking. Ellsworth Marchetta was indicted on 31 counts: healthcare fraud, wire fraud, making false statements in matters within the jurisdiction of a federal agency, and the one that made the sentencing judge take off her glasses, endangering the welfare of a child. 9 counts, 1 for each real kid. His defense was that his staff had run the enrollment, and he had trusted them. It survived until the government put up a chart with 2 rows on it: the site's dosing log and the refrigerator's door log, printed one above the other, for 400 days. He took a plea 11 days into trial, 19 years. Zane Pruitt went first and loudest and gave them everything, because men who are only dangerous when they hold the paperwork tend to fold the second somebody else is holding it. He'd been paid on volume, $2,200 a completed pediatric head, and he had recruited 14 children out of 3 support groups in 2 counties over 3 years. 11 years, and a restitution figure with a comma in it that he will be paying until he's old. Lorena Halbrook pleaded to 2 counts and cooperated. Her attorney argued, and it was probably true, that she had genuinely believed at the start that a monitored study was safer than the pediatrician she couldn't afford. The court noted, and this was also true, that she had continued for 11 months after her daughter's first nosebleed, that she had cashed $131,000 in stipends, and that she had filed a sworn petition to take a child away from the only person trying to stop it. She served 14 months. She has supervised visitation, 4 hours, every other Saturday, at a center on Route 9 with a fluorescent light that buzzes. Estella Winsett sold the bridal shop and moved to Florida and has told the story, in Florida, with herself in a different role. Hallowell Pharma pulled every data point that site had ever generated. 206 visits, 18 subjects, 9 of whom had never been born, and had to disclose to the FDA that a pediatric safety data set they'd been building for 3 years was contaminated. Their entire pediatric program on that compound went back to the beginning. The company also, quietly and without a press release, paid for every one of the 9 real children to be followed by an independent pediatric specialist for 10 years. Annika Straub was fired the day of the raid by a company that no longer existed by dinner time. She testified for 2 days. She is a study coordinator now at an academic medical center 3 states away, and she wrote Ray a letter after the sentencing that he keeps in the same drawer as his father's calipers. Newton Prather sat in the second row for the sentencing and did not say anything, and did not have to. Ellis is 14 now. He plays first base. The blood work came back clean at 3 years, and Newt still calls Ray on the anniversary of the raid, every year, and they talk about nothing for 20 minutes. Mirabelle Mayfield's family found out from a federal victim notification letter in Georgia that their daughter's medical identity had been used 200 times in a state she'd never lived in. Her mother, Bonnie, drove 8 hours to meet Ray in a diner in Delph. She wanted to know what the other girl was like, the one who'd been wearing her daughter's name. Ray showed her a photograph. Bonnie Mayfield looked at it for a long time and said, "She's got a good face," and cried, and that was the whole meeting. Josefina Arriaga testified for 11 minutes about a note she wrote on an order pad. The restitution fund set up in the settlement had a provision in it, added at Ray Halbrook's specific and stubborn insistence over the objection of 2 lawyers who said it wasn't standard. A scholarship line. Fina finished her nursing degree in the spring. She works pediatrics now. She keeps a photocopy of that order pad note in her locker, and when new hires ask about it, she says, "That's the day I found out that people will tell you the truth about a thing if you just hand it to them written down." Halbrook Cold Chain lost 19% of its revenue in 11 days and got it all back inside a year and then some, mostly from clinics that had read about the case and wanted the guy whose loggers you couldn't argue with. Josie Halbrook is 11 now. Her platelets came back to normal at 9 weeks and stayed there. She had a rough stretch around the 2nd anniversary where she wouldn't ride in anybody's car but her father's, and she saw a therapist for a year and a half, and she is, in the specific and unglamorous way that real kids get better. Better. She has a rule about being told where they're going before they leave the driveway, and Ray has never once, not one time in 2 years, made her ask twice. She asked him about it exactly once, on a drive, the way kids ask the enormous questions, sideways, looking out the window. "How did you know?" she said. "You weren't even there." And her father, who fixes refrigerators, said, "Because you told me, Bug. You put it out the window." Then he thought about it a while longer, because she deserved the real answer. "And because they wrote down a story," he said, "and stories can be anything people want, but they had to open a door to do it. And every time you open a door, something's counting." This is Nathan again. I've told you a lot of stories on this channel about people who fought back with money, or with connections, or with a friend in the right office. This one is my favorite kind, and it's the kind that almost never gets made into a movie, because Ray Halbrook won with an annual maintenance appointment. Think about what he actually did. He didn't chase the truck. He didn't swing on the guy who came to his shop and told him he'd already lost. Both of those would have felt incredible for about 9 seconds and then handed his daughter to the other side, because that's exactly what the machine was built to eat. An angry father is a file, and a man defending himself isn't investigating anybody. He said that in the story, and I want you to actually keep it. What he did instead was ask a question I think about all the time now. What does this system have to do that it can't fake? Every operation, every liar, every polished little racket has one. Some physical act it must perform for real, no matter how good the paperwork is. They had to open a refrigerator. That was it. That was the whole crack. The other thing I can't shake is Fina, 19 years old, minimum wage, and the only adult in the entire county who saw something wrong and did the small, risky, awkward thing about it. She could have told herself it wasn't her business 6 different ways, and every one of them would have sounded reasonable. Instead, she wrote 9 sentences on an order pad. That's the entire reason any of this happened. So, be a little more like the girl at the window. And when somebody hands you a piece of paper about your kid, read it, because the softest place in your whole life is the form you never bothered to look at. If this one got you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next story.